Anger is one of the most misunderstood emotions in human experience, often seen as a sign of weakness or a lack of self-control. Yet, deep within the human brain lies a powerful biological mechanism that fuels this emotion, shaping how we react to frustration, disappointment, and perceived threats. To understand the hidden triggers of anger, we must first look at the inner workings of the brain, particularly the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure located deep within the limbic system. The amygdala functions as the brain's emotional alarm system. Its primary job is to detect danger and prepare the body for survival. When it senses a threat, whether physical or emotional, it sends out a distress signal that activates the fight or flight response. This ancient reaction once kept our ancestors alive by preparing them to battle predators or flee from danger. The same system, however, now responds to modern stressors, arguments, deadlines, slow internet, or traffic jams, as if they were life-threatening situations. The result is a surge of anger or irritability, even when the threat is only psychological. What makes this process even more fascinating is how automatic it is. The amygdala can trigger a reaction before the rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, has time to process what's happening. This is why people sometimes say or do things in anger that they later regret. The emotional brain acts faster than the thinking brain. Within milliseconds, the amygdala floods the body with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, causing the heart to race, breathing to quicken, and muscles to tense. These changes prepare the body for immediate action, but in everyday life they often lead to unnecessary conflict or outbursts. The angry response that once helped humans survive in dangerous environments now tends to create more problems than it solves. Another important aspect of anger is perception. The amygdala does not differentiate between physical and emotional threats. Being insulted, ignored, or embarrassed can provoke the same physiological response as being physically attacked. When someone challenges our beliefs or damages our self-esteem, the brain interprets it as danger. The result is an emotional explosion that feels uncontrollable because it originates from a system designed to act automatically. This explains why irritability often arises even in minor situations. It's not always about what happened, but how the brain interpreted it. For example, being stuck in traffic can trigger anger not because of the traffic itself, but because the amygdala senses a loss of control or freedom, which it associates with threat. Additionally, past experiences and stress levels influence how easily this system activates. A brain that has been repeatedly exposed to conflict, trauma, or chronic stress becomes hypersensitive to perceived danger. It learns to fire the alarm more quickly even when the situation doesn't warrant it. This explains why some people seem to have a shorter temper than others. Their neural pathways for anger are more deeply conditioned. Once the amygdala's alarm is triggered, the brain and body react in unison, creating the familiar sensations of frustration and hostility. Over time, if this response becomes habitual, the brain strengthens those pathways, making irritability a default state. However, understanding this process doesn't mean anger is bad. In moderation, anger can be useful. It alerts us to unfairness, motivates change, and protects boundaries. The problem arises when the alarm system becomes overly sensitive, reacting to every inconvenience as a crisis. This imbalance reflects how the human brain has not fully adapted to modern life. Our ancestors faced physical threats that required instant reactions, while today's challenges are mostly emotional or social, requiring patience and thoughtfulness instead. Yet the same ancient circuitry still governs our responses. By learning how this system works, we can begin to interrupt it. The moment you recognize that anger is your brain's survival instinct misfiring, you gain power over it. Instead of reacting automatically, you can take a moment to pause, breathe, and let the thinking brain catch up. This short gap between impulse and action allows the prefrontal cortex to regain control, calming the amygdala and restoring balance. Understanding the hidden triggers of anger is the first step toward mastering it, because once you know where it begins, you can begin to choose how it ends. Inside the human brain exists a constant tug of war between reason and emotion, logic and instinct. When we talk about anger or irritability, this struggle becomes even more visible. At the center of this battle are two key players: the amygdala, the emotional alarm system, and the prefrontal cortex, the rational decision-making part of the brain. Under normal conditions, the prefrontal cortex acts as the brain's executive, keeping emotions under control and helping us respond thoughtfully instead of impulsively. It is responsible for planning, judgment, and self-regulation. However, during moments of stress, fatigue, or emotional overload, the balance between these two regions begins to break down. The prefrontal cortex weakens, and the amygdala takes over, turning rational humans into reactive beings driven by instinct rather than reasoning. When the brain detects a threat, the amygdala reacts almost instantly, sending alarm signals to prepare the body for action. In a fraction of a second, it releases stress hormones that increase heart rate, tighten muscles, and heighten alertness. This happens much faster than the prefrontal cortex can process what's going on. In fact, neuroscientists call this phenomenon an amygdala hijack. It means that the emotional brain literally overrides the logical brain, causing people to act before they think. That's why you might shout, slam a door, or say hurtful things during anger, only to regret it later when your rational mind comes back online. During these moments, the prefrontal cortex temporarily shuts down, losing its ability to evaluate consequences, consider perspectives, or regulate impulses. This process is heavily influenced by stress. When a person is under constant pressure, whether from work, relationships, or lack of sleep, the brain's stress response system becomes overactive. High levels of cortisol, the primary stress hormone, weaken the prefrontal cortex's ability to communicate effectively with the amygdala. Over time, this makes the brain more reactive and less reflective. It's why small annoyances feel much bigger when you're already tired or overwhelmed. The thinking brain simply doesn't have the energy to counteract the emotional surge. The result is a shorter temper, reduced patience, and increased impulsivity. In essence, the prefrontal cortex shuts down not because it wants to, but because the emotional system consumes all the brain's attention and resources. Scientific studies using brain imaging have shown that when people experience anger, activity in the prefrontal cortex drops while activity in the amygdala spikes. This shift explains why anger often feels uncontrollable. It's not just a feeling, but a neurological event. The more intense the emotion, the less access you have to logical thinking. That's why arguments can spiral out of control and why people sometimes act in ways completely out of character. When the prefrontal cortex is offline, empathy also declines. You stop seeing the other person's point of view because your brain is focused entirely on defending itself from a perceived threat. This is why anger so easily turns relationships into battlegrounds. The good news is that this imbalance isn't permanent. The prefrontal cortex can be strengthened just like a muscle through consistent practice. Mindfulness, meditation, and deep breathing all help re-engage the rational brain. When you slow your breathing, it sends a calming signal to the nervous system, allowing the prefrontal cortex to regain control. Over time, regular mindfulness training has been shown to thicken the prefrontal cortex and improve communication with the amygdala, making emotional regulation easier. This means that while anger may start automatically, how it unfolds depends on how well you train your brain to respond. Recognizing when your thinking brain is shutting down is the first step to preventing emotional overreactions. By pausing before speaking, by taking a few deep breaths, or by simply walking away for a moment, you give your prefrontal cortex time to re-engage. The difference between reacting in anger and responding with calm lies in those few seconds of awareness. When logic returns, perspective widens, empathy grows, and what once felt like an unbearable insult or frustration becomes manageable. In the end, anger is not just an emotional reaction. It is a neurological tug-of-war that can be balanced through awareness, patience, and consistent mental training. The chemistry of irritability reveals that anger is not only a matter of emotion, but a complex dance of brain chemicals and hormones. Every mood, reaction, and emotional impulse in the human brain is influenced by neurotransmitters and hormones that shape how we think, feel, and behave. When these chemicals fall out of balance due to stress, lack of sleep, poor diet, or emotional strain, irritability becomes almost inevitable. The most significant players in this process are serotonin, dopamine, and cortisol. Each of these substances has a specific role in regulating mood and emotional stability, and when any one of them fluctuates, it alters how we experience and respond to stress. Serotonin is often called the feel-good chemical because it stabilizes mood and promotes calmness and contentment. It helps keep the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, under control. When serotonin levels are healthy, people can handle frustration more rationally and stay composed under pressure. However, when serotonin levels drop, often due to lack of sleep, chronic stress, or a poor diet, the amygdala becomes more reactive. This means the brain starts interpreting ordinary challenges as threats. Small inconveniences suddenly feel overwhelming, and people become more irritable and impulsive. Low serotonin levels are one of the primary biochemical reasons why irritability increases during fatigue or stress. It's not simply that a person is in a bad mood. Their brain's chemistry has shifted towards sensitivity and reactivity. Dopamine, another critical neurotransmitter, plays a slightly different role. It governs motivation, pleasure, and reward. When dopamine levels are balanced, individuals feel driven, focused, and emotionally regulated. But when dopamine drops, often from stress, boredom, or sleep deprivation, it leads to restlessness and dissatisfaction. This makes people more prone to irritation because their brains crave stimulation and satisfaction that never seem to come. On the other hand, too much dopamine can lead to overexcitability and impulsive behavior. Maintaining equilibrium in dopamine levels is essential for emotional control. This is one reason why activities that boost dopamine in healthy ways, like exercise, goal setting, or creativity, can reduce irritability and improve overall mood. Cortisol, the body's main stress hormone, is another key chemical in the story of irritability. In small amounts, cortisol helps the body respond to stress effectively. But chronic stress keeps cortisol levels elevated for too long, which disrupts the brain's communication networks. High cortisol levels weaken the connection between the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, and the amygdala, the emotional center. This breakdown makes it harder to think clearly and easier to react emotionally. When cortisol floods the system, the body remains in a constant state of alertness, ready for conflict even when none exists. Over time, this can create a baseline state of irritability and anxiety that feels uncontrollable. Chronic stress doesn't just affect emotion. It physically alters the brain's wiring, making emotional regulation increasingly difficult. Beyond these main chemicals, other factors like blood sugar levels and hydration also play significant roles in shaping mood. When blood sugar drops, the brain struggles to access the energy it needs to function properly. This triggers irritability and impatience, what people commonly refer to as being hangry. Dehydration has a similar effect, reducing oxygen flow to the brain and impairing concentration. Both conditions interfere with neurotransmitter function, compounding emotional instability. This biochemical vulnerability explains why skipping meals or not drinking enough water can make people unreasonably short-tempered. These chemical processes are interconnected. When serotonin is low, cortisol tends to rise. When dopamine is imbalanced, the brain's reward system falters, fueling dissatisfaction. Together, they form a delicate ecosystem that determines emotional resilience. Modern lifestyles marked by stress, irregular sleep, fast food, and constant stimulation disrupt this balance, making irritability more common. Yet the same chemistry that triggers anger can also be harnessed to calm it. Regular exercise increases serotonin and dopamine while lowering cortisol. Mindfulness practices regulate stress hormones and improve neurotransmitter balance. Even spending time outdoors or getting sunlight helps the brain produce serotonin naturally. Understanding the chemistry of irritability helps demystify anger. It shows that frustration is not just an emotional flaw, but a biological reaction influenced by the brain's internal environment. When these chemicals are in harmony, the mind feels calm and focused. When they are imbalanced, the smallest challenge feels unbearable. Managing irritability, therefore, begins not just with willpower or emotional control, but with nurturing the brain's chemical balance through healthy sleep, nutrition, and stress management. The chemistry of anger is powerful, but with awareness and care, it can be guided toward peace and stability. The way we eat, sleep, and manage stress has a profound influence on how our brain regulates emotions. Irritability is not just the result of bad moods or difficult situations. It is often the product of biological imbalances caused by poor lifestyle habits. Every choice we make, from skipping breakfast to staying up late, affects the chemistry and wiring of the brain. When the body is undernourished, exhausted, or overwhelmed, the brain's emotional centers become hyperactive while its rational controls weaken. As a result, even minor inconveniences can provoke anger or frustration. The connection between lifestyle and emotional control is far stronger than most people realize. Food is one of the most powerful factors shaping mood and emotional stability. The brain relies on glucose for energy, and when blood sugar levels fluctuate, it affects how we think and feel. Eating large amounts of processed foods or refined carbohydrates causes rapid spikes and crashes in blood sugar. During these crashes, the brain struggles to function efficiently, triggering irritability, restlessness, and even aggression. This is why skipping meals or relying on sugary snacks can make a person feel it is not a personality change, but a physiological reaction to the brain being deprived of steady energy. In contrast, balanced meals rich in protein, complex carbohydrates, and healthy fats provide a stable fuel source supporting steady mood and concentration. Micronutrients also play a crucial role. Deficiencies in vitamins like B12, D, and minerals such as magnesium and zinc can contribute to mood swings and irritability. These nutrients are essential for producing neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine that regulate emotions. When the body lacks them, the brain becomes chemically unbalanced, leaving people more vulnerable to stress and emotional volatility. Even dehydration has a significant effect on mood. The brain is about 70% water, and a slight drop in hydration levels can reduce blood flow and oxygen delivery to brain cells. This leads to fatigue, poor concentration. Sleep is another cornerstone of emotional health. How? When the brain does not get enough rest, it loses its ability to manage emotions effectively. During deep sleep, the brain processes emotional experiences, repairs neural connections, and clears away stress hormones like cortisol. Without sufficient sleep, the amygdala becomes overactive, responding strongly to negative stimuli, while the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment and control, loses strength. Studies show that sleep-deprived people are up to 60% more reactive to unpleasant experiences than well-rested individuals. This explains why irritability rises sharply after just one night of poor sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation keeps the brain in a state of emotional instability, amplifying anger, anxiety, and impulsivity. Stress acts as a silent amplifier of all these effects. When a person is under constant stress, the body remains flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones were meant for short bursts of activity, not long-term exposure. Persistent stress interferes with neurotransmitter balance, disrupts sleep patterns, and increases cravings for unhealthy food, all of which further strain the brain. Over time, the constant presence of stress hormones weakens the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. This makes it harder to calm down after becoming angry, trapping individuals in cycles of frustration and fatigue. Stress not only heightens irritability, but also reduces the brain's ability to recover from it. Fortunately, lifestyle changes can restore this balance. Regular exercise, for example, boosts serotonin and dopamine levels while lowering cortisol. Physical movement helps the body release tension and improves sleep quality, making it easier to stay calm under pressure. Proper hydration and nutrition give the brain the energy it needs to think clearly and regulate emotions. Establishing a consistent sleep routine strengthens the brain's emotional control systems, reducing overreactions to stress. Even simple relaxation techniques such as deep breathing, mindfulness, or spending time in nature can reset the nervous system, shifting the body out of survival mode. Modern life often pushes people to ignore these basic needs, but the brain's emotional health depends on them. Irritability is often the first signal that the body and mind are out of alignment. By paying attention to diet, rest, and stress management, we don't just improve our physical health, we stabilize the emotional systems that shape how we experience the world. The foundation of emotional control is not built solely on willpower, but on how we fuel, rest, and care for the brain that guides every reaction and response. The human brain is not fixed. It is constantly changing, adapting and reshaping itself based on what we think, feel, and do. This remarkable ability, known as neuroplasticity, means that even deeply ingrained emotional patterns like anger and irritability can be rewired. The same pathways that once fueled emotional outbursts can be reshaped to promote calmness, patience, and control. Understanding that the angry brain is flexible rather than permanent opens the door to lasting emotional transformation. Through consistent practice and intentional behavior, it is possible to train the brain to respond to stress with clarity instead of aggression, and to challenges with composure instead of reactivity. When a person becomes angry, it is often because the amygdala has taken control and overridden the rational brain. The key to rewiring this pattern is to strengthen the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Mindfulness and meditation are among the most effective ways to do this. Neuroscientific studies have shown that people who meditate regularly have a thicker prefrontal cortex and reduced activity in the amygdala. This means they can regulate emotions more easily and recover from anger more quickly. Mindfulness works because it teaches awareness. When you become conscious of your emotional triggers, you can intervene before they spiral out of control. Instead of reacting instantly, you observe the emotion, label it, and allow it to pass without judgment. Over time, this practice rewires neural circuits, making calmness a more automatic response. Deep breathing is another powerful tool for rewiring the emotional brain. When we become angry, breathing becomes shallow and rapid, signaling the body to stay in a state of alert. Slow, controlled breathing reverses this process by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's natural calming mechanism. Each slow breath sends a message to the brain that it is safe, which reduces amygdala activity and helps the prefrontal cortex regain control. This simple act, when practiced consistently, creates new associations in the brain between stressful moments and calm responses. Over time, the mind begins to default to balance instead of panic or rage. Physical exercise also contributes significantly to emotional regulation. Exercise releases endorphins, serotonin, and dopamine, which are chemicals that elevate mood and promote emotional stability. It also reduces cortisol levels, lowering the overall stress burden on the brain. Consistent movement helps reset the nervous system, allowing emotions to flow rather than become trapped and explosive. People who exercise regularly often report greater emotional resilience because their brains are better equipped to handle tension and recover from it. The rhythmic and repetitive nature of physical activity, like walking, swimming, or running, also has a meditative quality that enhances focus and calmness. Sleep plays an equally important role in rewiring the brain for emotional balance. During deep sleep, the brain processes emotional experiences, repairs neural pathways, and strengthens new learning. When sleep is consistent and restorative, the connection between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex grows stronger. When sleep is poor, this connection weakens, making irritability and impulsivity more likely. Rewiring the brain for calmness, therefore, requires giving it the time it needs to recover each night. The simple habit of maintaining a healthy sleep routine can dramatically improve emotional stability. Practices like gratitude, journaling, and positive visualization can also reshape emotional responses. When you focus on gratitude or visualize calm reactions to stressful situations, you train your brain to associate challenges with peace rather than tension. This mental rehearsal strengthens the neural circuits responsible for emotional control. Over time, what once triggered anger begins to feel less threatening, and the mind learns to remain composed under pressure. Rewiring the brain does not happen overnight. It requires consistency and patience. The same way that negative thought patterns become automatic through repetition, positive habits must be repeated until they form new defaults. Every moment of awareness, every deep breath, every act of patience is a small step in sculpting a calmer brain. The more these actions are practiced, the more natural they become, transforming emotional reactivity into emotional intelligence. Through conscious effort, mindfulness, and care for both body and mind, the brain's response to anger can be retrained. The neural pathways that once led to conflict can instead lead to peace, proving that emotional control is not just learned, it is built, strengthened, and wired into the very structure of the brain. Understanding the deeper science behind irritability transforms anger from something to be feared or suppressed into something to be understood and managed. When people realize that anger is not just a random burst of emotion, but a signal from the brain, they begin to see it different. Anger is not the enemy, it is a message that something inside needs attention. It often arises when needs are unmet, boundaries are crossed, or stress has gone unchecked. By paying attention to these signals instead of reacting blindly, individuals can use anger as a guide toward greater self-awareness and emotional balance. The shift from reaction to understanding begins when we stop asking, "Why am I angry?" Start asking, "What is my anger trying to tell me?" Anger is a secondary emotion. It often hides something deeper: fear, sadness, exhaustion, or frustration. For example, when someone feels disrespected or ignored, the brain interprets it as a threat to self-worth, and anger surfaces as a protective response. But beneath that anger lies a more vulnerable emotion, the pain of feeling undervalued. Recognizing this hidden layer requires awareness and honesty. When you acknowledge what lies underneath, the anger begins to lose its grip. Instead of fighting it, you begin to understand it. This understanding gives you space to respond rather than react. The emotional charge softens because the mind no longer sees the situation as an attack, but as information. The act of observing anger, instead of becoming consumed by it, activates the rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. This is the part that helps interpret emotions and make thoughtful decisions. When we learn to pause, breathe, and notice what is happening inside us, we strengthen the communication between the emotional and rational centers of the brain. That brief pause creates a window for choice, allowing us to decide how to respond instead of letting instinct take over. This is the foundation of emotional intelligence, the ability to notice feelings, understand their origins, and manage them constructively. Developing this awareness requires practice. Techniques like mindfulness and reflection can help train the brain to stay calm in the face of irritation. Mindfulness teaches people to witness emotions as they arise without judgment. Instead of labeling anger as a bad, mindfulness encourages curiosity. What triggered it, and what can it teach me? This approach reduces shame and increases control. The more one practices mindfulness, the more resilient the brain becomes. The amygdala, responsible for the emotional alarm, becomes less reactive, while the prefrontal cortex grows stronger, making it easier to think clearly during tense moments. Empathy also plays a crucial role in transforming anger. When we try to see a situation from another person's perspective, the brain releases oxytocin, a hormone that promotes trust and connection. This biochemical shift softens defensive reactions and reduces feelings of hostility. Anger thrives on separation and misunderstanding. but empathy dissolves that divide. By choosing to understand instead of attack, the emotional energy of anger can be redirected toward problem solving and compassion. This doesn't mean suppressing anger, but channeling it into actions that heal rather than harm. Turning anger into understanding also involves forgiveness, both for others and for oneself. Holding on to anger keeps the brain trapped in a state of tension, constantly reactivating the stress response. Forgiveness, on the other hand, releases that hold. It's not about excusing harmful behavior, but freeing the mind from the constant replay of pain. Neuroimaging studies have shown that practicing forgiveness reduces activity in the amygdala and increases activity in areas of the brain related to empathy and positive emotion. Letting go of resentment literally changes brain chemistry, replacing emotional chaos with peace. When people begin to interpret their anger as a signal rather than a flaw, they gain power over it. The emotion no longer dictates behavior but becomes a tool for growth. Anger can point toward boundaries that need reinforcing, values that need honoring, or emotions that need expression. Instead of being consumed by irritation, individuals can use it as a guide toward clarity and purpose. Understanding the brain's role in anger turns emotional reaction into emotional wisdom. With awareness, empathy, and reflection, anger becomes not a storm to suppress, but a teacher that helps shape a calmer, stronger, and more conscious mind.